Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special WEDI Virtual Spotlight, CMS-0057F, Streamlining Prior Authorization and Delegated Vendor Collaboration. This is part one of a two-part educational series sponsored by Itility Health. It's my pleasure to introduce Michael Lunzer, CEO and founder of Itility Health.
Thank you, Michael. Really appreciate that kind introduction. Itility Health is excited to be here today with you to present the first part of a two-part series on streamlining prior authorization, specifically focused on some of the more complex elements of the CMS-0057 architecture. Today, we'll be highlighting the challenges around delegated vendor collaboration. With me today is Keith Brick, interoperability architect for Itility Health. And again, I'm Michael Lunzer. I'm the CEO and founder of the company.
Thank you, Michael.
For today, we'll be answering a number of questions for you. Again, very much focused on the delegated vendor connectivity within the CMS-0057 world. Specifically, the first question is, how do delegated vendors fit into this architecture? How does the CRD know if a delegated vendor procedure requires prior authorization? Where does that answer come from? How does the provider system get a DTR questionnaire from a delegated vendor? Does it ultimately go direct to that delegated vendor? Does it get passed through multiple tools? How does that connectivity work? Also, where does the pass transaction get sent? How does that get routed, ultimately landing at either the delegated vendor or the health plan system? How do those transactions get routed? And then how do delegated vendors fit into the approval communication process? How does that approval route itself back to the provider ultimately? And then we have one additional random question that we added for clarification today, because we seem to be getting this question quite often. And we'll talk much more specifically about this at the end of the presentation. Do all policies, do all guidelines need a complex clinical questionnaire with coded questions that can be automatically gathered from the EMR system? What is the minimum viable requirement, and what's a reasonable approach for today, and what's the ultimate approach? So those are the questions we will make sure that you understand the answers to when we get done with the presentation today. So first, I just have a very small number of high-level slides to make sure that everybody's grounded on the core of what we're trying to accomplish with 0057. So first of all, prior authorization starts fairly simply. A provider wants to know, does this require a prior authorization? And they want to know, what information does the health plan need in order to make a decision? In today's world, it's shockingly difficult to get that information as a provider from a payer. And the reason is prior authorization at a health plan, although it starts simple, the health plan has fairly complicated rules. Answering the questions, is a prior authorization required? What data does the policy need? And is it approved? Those are really complex questions in the current health plan technology stack. So really, the payer needs a method or a system that can help answer those questions in a machine-readable format that can work in today's modern technical environment. And so we're going to segue on now to CMS-0057 and what that structure looks like. And I'm going to pass the baton over to Keith to present the next section of our presentation. Keith?
Great. So within the prior authorization APIs, 0057 talks about the DaVinci implementation guide, which breaks it down into 3 steps: the coverage requirements discovery, the documentation, templates, and rules, and the prior authorization submission. So these are 3 separate functions within a prior authorization workflow. And the goal is to bring these steps right into the EHR experience for a provider. So we don't want the provider to have to visit a website, make a phone call, or send a fax. Our goal is to bring this information using those APIs directly into their workflow so that as they place an order behind the scenes, we can begin asking these questions and get for the provider the questionnaire that they need to fill out, or that even better, their EHR can fill out for them. And the last step in prior authorization submission, that completed questionnaire is sent to the patient's health plan. And this is where, on the payer side, your metrics begin counting the timer. So we need to have very fast turnaround times in order to satisfy other requirements within CMS-0057. And those turnaround times start when they send us a prior authorization submission. So our goal is to make sure that we have as much of the necessary information in that submission as possible. Now, unfortunately, on the next slide, the process of finding the right rules and finding the right question or set of questions to ask, and even asking a delegated third party, for example, to evaluate a submitted form, this means that within the health plan, you need additional connectivity, not just to all the payers, or not just from the provider offices into your health plan, but also from your health plan out to our delegated vendors. So on our next slide, the delegated vendors today might provide your plan specific guidance for musculoskeletal policies, behavioral health, durable medical equipment. And we've been working with them within the DaVinci pilots and within utilities work at Connectathons. We're working with them to help them speak the same language that the provider's office is going to speak, those same CMS-57 APIs. So when an inbound request comes in, is prior authorization required? The health plan can say, well, this looks like a musculoskeletal policy. Let's send it over to the appropriate delegated vendor so that they now have the information necessary to answer that question. On the next slide, the way that we're going to do this within Utility Health is with a series of steps that are described, defined within each of our application modules. So PA checkpoint is where in that first step, is prior authorization required? We can evaluate the policies and rules that a health plan has implemented and say, well, for this procedure, for example, for a knee replacement, we know that we need to consult a delegated vendor. So that's the first step in the routing. When we consult a delegated vendor, we can, behind the scenes, get back the questionnaire that's appropriate for that knee replacement. And we can make it available to the healthcare provider so that they can then begin filling it out. And if it is coded, their EHR can automatically fill out some of those questions. And in the last step, so we've consulted our policy management database, we've proxied out to MCG or Interqual, one of those delegated vendors, we found the questionnaire and loaded it up for the provider, provided it back to them. And the last step, they need to complete that form and submit electronically that prior authorization submission. So we can evaluate it against our own internal rules within automatic authorization. We can make it available to the utilization management system. We can support the mapping of information in that submission to the policy and requirements. And we can even route that submission bundle out to the delegated vendor if they want to have the delegated vendor perform that evaluation or medical review. We know that that's a common workflow for some payers. So connectivity is, in our vision, something that should happen between the healthcare provider and the patient's health plan, and between the patient's health plan and the delegated vendors. This means that from the provider's side, they're just asking, hey, Blue Cross Blue Shield, does Keith need prior authorization in order to have this procedure performed? And then the health plan can, behind the scenes, consult that delegated vendor to find the answer. The language that we're speaking are these FHIR APIs. We're using the clinical decision support hooks to request that information, and we're using FHIR resources to represent the answers to is authorization required, and the questionnaire that needs to be filled out, and the questionnaire bundle, questionnaire response that is going to have all of the answers from the EHR. I want to mention one other really cool thing that happens when the EHR is reaching out to the patient's health plan. It's saying, does Keith need a prior authorization for this procedure? And by the way, here's a authorization that you can use to collect whatever data you need electronically to answer that question. So a FHIR authorization is included at the very beginning of this workflow that allows the health plan to retrieve data from the EHR's FHIR server. And we're really excited to be able to take full advantage of that throughout this process. And then as that data is collected, made available to fill out those forms, we can also make it available to our delegated vendors. So Michael, I think I'll hand it back to you so we can talk about the configuration that happens in PA Checkpoint, and we'll set you up for the demo.
Right. Thank you, Keith. Keith did a great job giving us an overview of the way these transactions flow. And now I'd like to go a little deeper into the explicit details of how this process works. With this diagram, we've simplified the picture. So we've connected the provider EHR directly to the utility health service. So the yellow dot talking to the green dot. Keep in mind that in a real world example, there'd be some more network connectivity in between the provider EHR, and the physical connectivity or the virtual connectivity of these devices would be all FHIR and essentially all through a network. But this type of diagram helps to simplify it from a workflow perspective and help people understand what the steps are that things perform. So as Keith alluded to, first, the provider would sign an order or provision a procedure for a specific date. And at that point, they're going to process a CRD request to Utility Health. And Utility Health, inside of our configuration, knows whether or not a prior auth is required, or if we aren't the source of truth for that information, we know where to go to get that answer. Meaning that it might be a procedure code that's within the utility health scope, configured in the utility health system, that says, yes, this requires a prior authorization, and this is the particular policy that applies. Or there's another series of procedure codes that are configured within utility health systems that are configured to say the answer for is auth required and policies and other details is going to come from the delegated vendor. So again, we're going to receive, whoops, I must have clicked the button. We're going to receive that API request saying, is a prior auth required? If we know the answer to that question, we will answer it. If it's a procedure that is delegated, we'll go ahead and pass that question on to the delegated vendor. And when they answer it, we'll pass it back to the provider EHR. So once the provider EHR knows, yes, prior authorization is required, and the provider says, I want to submit a prior authorization, what happens is they actually get from us in the CRD response a URL that the system in the API selects, which again travels back either directly to Utility Health, if that URL response we gave in this first transaction said that this was going to be a policy that's going to be handled directly by Utility Health, or if this is a policy that's going to be handled by the delegated vendor, when we send back that CRD response, we give them a slightly different URL, and that URL will still come to Utility Health, but we will then know, is this a DTR questionnaire that Utility Health needs to answer, or is this a DTR questionnaire that we're going to proxy or send on to the delegated vendor and ask for? And when the delegated vendor sends it, they send it back to Utility Health, and we send it back to the provider EHR. So at this point, the provider EHR is going to fill out the data that it can based upon coded questionnaires. If there are questionnaires or questions or document attachments that aren't coded that a human needs to interact with, the human would perform the process of answering all the questions. And when they submit that questionnaire back to the payer and any documents, Itility Health is going to be the first destination. And we're going to proxy that pass submission. And this kind of depends on how the configuration is set up. But typically, again, if Itility Health is the source of the DTR questionnaire, we will receive that, act on it, automatically approve it if appropriate, or send it on to the payer's utilization management system as appended or approved prior auth. In the event that the DTR was provided by the delegated vendor, that submission comes back to Itility Health. We know that that DTR is a delegated vendor DTR, and we know who it's destined for, and we send it on to the delegated vendor. They perform their approval processes and pass it back to the utilization management system for notification and normal processing. Typically, letters are sent. There would also typically be a process of sending back a response back through Itility Health that becomes their pass entry point, which is where the provider would come to verify status of that prior authorization through the pass interface. I'm going to pause there, and I am a high-level explainer of these technologies and these transactions. So I'd like to ask Keith if you have some additions that you'd like to make or adjustments to the description that I've given, because I think this is one of the core questions that we're here to answer, which is, how does this actually work? What do these transactions look like? We get this question a lot. So Keith?
So the answer to this question actually is also going to answer Justin's question in the chat. So why do we want to have Itility handle the routing and logic, for example, if they have Availity or MCG? I think the answer is for a given health plan, the goal is to offer up a single set of endpoints that the provider's EHR is going to reach out to. So if Keith has Blue Cross Blue Shield, the answers to all of these questions need to come from APIs at the Blue Cross Blue Shield URLs. And so behind those URLs, there's a set of services that Itility has as the logic front door. So we're going to be the ones to figure out, okay, for this information that was presented in the initial CDS hook, so there's context, there's coverage, there's patient information, procedure information, the date that it's going to be performed, who's going to be performing it. All of that information is used to help us make the initial decision of which vendor is going to handle this request. It's similar to what Availity does, for example, in web portals, where you might have to fill in a big form before it even tells you, well, okay, now you need to go fill out a form on some other website. And so our goal is to make this a programmatic process that the EHR is going to give us that context from the doctor clicking the sign order button. And we're going to immediately fetch and return the appropriate questionnaires or the appropriate required information for that order that the doctor placed. So that's the goal. We'll talk a little bit more about how those connections actually work after the demonstration. But I wanted to answer Justin's question while we're here. I do also want to express that the questionnaire endpoint is more than just serve up a form. It's actually serve up a form that can answer its questions automatically using data from the EHR. It can skip over questions that aren't relevant to a given procedure. And it can allow a provider to upload attachments. So if there's a uncoded type of information, maybe a scanned document or an image that needs to be uploaded to support a medical necessity, that information can also be attached within the questionnaire using the submit attachment operation. So all of these pieces reflect what today might be happening in a web portal or on a website or via fax. And now what we're doing is we're saying, let's all agree industry-wide on a set of standards defined by the HL7 community, defined within FHIR, and these implementation guides. Let's agree on that set of standards as the way we will pass this information back and forth. And the federal government has given its blessing, said, yep, you no longer are restricted to using X12. You can use X12, FHIR, combination of the two. And the important thing is that you have these capabilities available and that you have good turnaround times once they do actually submit a prior authorization request to you. All right, Michael, back to you for the demo.
Yeah, I wanted to expound on that question because I think it's such a good question and it's really critical, which in essence says, why does ITILITY get to be the decision maker or the router when a policy is going to be owned by a different vendor? Well, the essence of that answer is somebody somewhere needs to have a configuration that knows by procedure code, where do I go? ITILITY Health's PA Checkpoint product is a software as a service, very simple product to configure and use. And our customers have found it to be a very effective and efficient way to answer and configure that information. There are scenarios where a customer might choose to use a FHIR router or a FHIR interoperability server in between the provider EHR and ITILITY. And then conceptually, that FHIR server could be the routing destination. The challenge there is those products typically don't have a native software as a service configurable, easy way to route. They rely on a table, a database somewhere to know for this procedure code, I need to go to MCG or Evacor or Carelon. So in order to know that, we need a place to configure it. We need a place that's easy to manage, easy to interpret, and also can extend that data to additional data about policies and other information. And we'll show you in a minute on the ITILITY Health systems where that's configured and how simple it is to see that information. And again, this is an option if a health plan wants to have that routing performed in an interoperability server. They also need to make sure that that server and that data has an effective way to configure it, manage it, change it. It needs to be date driven and have lots of controls around editing and managing that data. So that's enough on that topic. Next on, I'd like to take you into a demonstration. Frankly, it's actually screenshots from a demonstration, primarily because in a PowerPoint or in a presentation like this, it's really hard to make sure that we've got all the clicks going in the right destinations. But we'd be happy to give you the actual live demonstration of these capabilities as well and go much deeper into the configuration of the platform. So ITILITY Health as a product is a platform that has multiple products within it. One of those products is called PA Checkpoint, and that is the product that helps answer, does it require prior authorization? Policy management is where the policies are stored for the health plan's policies, as well as knowing where third-party policies exist. And then auto authorization is our pass receiver and also automates authorizations. Again, trying to get away from this just being an ITILITY Health presentation, essentially what you need as a payer is you need a source of truth for those prior auth rules. Does it require prior auth? You really need that to be a database. Most health plans have spreadsheets today. The policies need to be live and digitally incorporated. And so you need a source that can ingest your policies and represent those in a questionnaire. The ITILITY Health product is more than just the conversion of your policies into a questionnaire. It's a product that helps you manage the policy all the way up to changing the human readable version and the digital version and unifying those versions and versioning and archiving, etc. It also is the digital front door for the health plan's medical policies on their public website, as well as the digital policy store. And auto authorization, again, is a means of receiving that pass and interrogating the submitted data and making decisions. So first, I'm going to go over and show you in the application where the policy, where the policy is connected to the procedure codes. So what you see here is the policy name, and we've selected associations for that policy, which then lets us see which procedure codes belong to this policy and whether or not they require prior authorization, the prior authorization yes or no, and the procedure code association to a policy also have effective dates and end dates, which is really important because you need a system that can track the fact that 2 weeks ago you were using a different policy than the one you use today, or in 2 weeks you're going to use a different policy than the one you use today, or in this case the procedure code's value is going to change from required to not required at some future date or past date. So again, this is the place where we've configured the association of the rules for a policy. This would be a policy that is part of the health plan's book of policies, where that policy is configured to specific procedure codes and whether or not they require prior authorization. There's another element of our application that allows us to configure procedure codes to the delegated vendor. So in this case, you see this is what we call a program. And this program is the musculoskeletal program for this client with an effective date of 1/1/2001 and no end date. And again, this is an EviCore book of procedures. And within this program, I can tell the system that these are the procedures that are going to be sent to EviCore. In our website view of this, the Utility Health application can also show the representation of these procedure codes ending up at EviCore. Oops, I don't know why I'm doing that. Can show that these procedure codes are going to end up at EviCore through a human readable experience in the actual DTR experience. So when the CRD, when the CRD from the provider comes in and says, I've got a procedure code of 15842, and I want to know, does it require a prior authorization? Utility Health's system knows that that procedure code is owned by EviCore, so we can go ahead and proxy that CRD transaction over to EviCore and let them answer the question. It's also optional for the health plan to configure the answer here, in which case we can answer it directly. Within the EviCore configuration of Utility Health, we know their networking connection addresses and such so that we can route those transactions appropriately. So as I mentioned, the Utility Health application allows you to see policies in the human readable form on the health plan website. So for example, right here, we're looking at the landing page for a health plan where a provider or a member could come to see what's the policy for this particular procedure code. Of course, they can perform keyword search, and they can select the date that the policy is effective for, and whether they're looking at final policies or if they also want to see draft policies from the payer. And once they've selected a particular version that they want to see from down below, it brings up the policy as you would normally see on the health plan's public website. What you don't see is, as I showed you a minute ago, a policy in Utility Health a policy inside of Utility Health is broken up into, I'm getting to the wrong screen here, sorry. A policy inside Utility Health is actually deconstructed into multiple sections. So when we display this policy, we're actually dynamically assembling this policy for the screen, but we also have human readable sections of each portion of the policy and machine readable policy sections for those that are appropriate to have a machine readable section. And the machine readable section is automatically converted by our application into CQL that can then be sent over to the provider's system and displayed as a questionnaire. So again, just to reiterate the workflow, the is auth required comes over to Itility Health. We can either answer those questions or we can delegate that answer for certain procedure codes to the delegated vendor, send those back to the provider. The DTR can be sent from the delegated vendor back to the provider or from Itility Health, depending on whether it's a policy that's fully managed in Itility Health or a delegated vendor. And then when the pass is sent, it can be received by Itility Health, auto-approved, or if a delegated vendor, it can be sent directly to the delegated vendor and then on to the UM system. We're going to pause for questions in a few slides, so bear with us. But again, we'd love to have your questions in the chat as well. So Keith, I'm going to pass it back to you, and you can talk a little bit more about what the network world looks like with these transactions.
Absolutely. So not only do we have CMS-0057, but we also have the federal initiative, the Trusted Exchange Framework and Common Agreement. This lays out the technology that providers can use to talk to their qualified health information network, which is one of a member of nodes that span nationwide, a network of networks. So the healthcare provider connects to their QHIN, and the QHIN can help them handle the routing to the payer, and it works in reverse. The QHIN can also support a payer connecting as a requester to go back to the provider's EHR to retrieve information. So this is a bi-directional connection that uses the FHIR capabilities defined under TEFCA. And what we are proposing and advocating for, and what we've had great engagement from our delegated policy vendors, is that we continue using that same language as we connect out to those delegated policy vendors. So we're going to keep using FHIR. We're going to keep using the implementation guides that are supported under TEFCA. And so far, everyone's on board. We're making great progress to it. I wanted to add a little bit of detail to my answer for Justin earlier. We are seeing that as the implementation progresses, more and more policies are available as electronic questionnaires. And those electronic questionnaires we expect to be fully available sometime next year. And on the next slide, we can talk about what is the role of a qualified health information network. So it is responsible for facilitating the connectivity with the providers on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, it is going to be able to connect to multiple payers. And that qualified health information network can also, along the way, talk to other qualified health information networks. So you can have QHINs talking to one another, and TEFCA also defines the mechanisms for them to do that. For example, a healthcare provider might have a single connection that says, I would really like my QHIN to find out which payers have data about Keith. Keith has had 3 different insurances over the last year. Maybe he changed jobs or moved. So let's reach out to all those health plans and say, hey, does Keith, this set of demographics, match the member information that you have in any of your patient databases? And those payer health plans can respond, yes, we've got that information available. Similarly, the payer health plans can talk to one another to facilitate the transmission of data for a patient who is moving between plans. So all of this is facilitated by a common language that's defined. The technical exchange framework is the technology piece, and the common agreement is the policy piece that allows everybody to say, all right, this is the exchange purpose. This is what I'm asking. This is why I'm asking. And this is who I am. And the Qualified Health Information Network, the QHIN, allows them to reach out and say, all right, here are all the providers who might have data about that patient. Here are all the payers who might have data about that patient. And for a given request, here's a procedure that needs authorization. They can say, all right, this patient's insurance is over here. It's Blue Cross Blue Shield. Let's route over to them so that they can begin answering these questions. All right.
Keith, if you could do me a favor and just kind of circle back and define QHIN. I know you've used that term a couple of times, and how a QHIN relates to TEFCA.
Sure. So TEFCA defines the role of the QHIN as an intermediary that is going to talk to the other QHINs, the other like parent nodes, in order to perform functions such as patient discovery. And it uses the same technology that today functions like the Care Quality Network and Epic's Care Everywhere use for the treatment purpose. And what it does is it extends so that in the future, it's not just going to be limited to treatment providers talking to providers, but also payment and operations and public health. And these functions are new exchange purposes that will be supported at the network level. The Trusted Exchange Framework, the technology part, allows the QHINs to talk to one another to facilitate things like patient discovery and routing. And it also says that the QHIN should use FHIR and facilitate FHIR for when two requesters or two responders are trying to connect to one another. And so think of it as an internet service provider, and you are an individual customer going up to your internet service provider. You don't need a different ISP to go to a Google website versus an Amazon website. That single connection to your ISP allows you to then route to all of those other features on the network.
It often dates me, but I think of it as the telephone company. It's just one simple connection for each party in the equation that allows them all to talk to one another. One other quick point, we use the term QHIN a lot, and in case you haven't caught it, it's the QHIN stands for Qualified Health Information Network as a way to describe that. So thank you, Keith. So next we'd like to cover this one question that we get quite often, and we thought this would be a good technical audience that would be appropriate for answering this random question. We get this a lot. Do all of the health plan policies need a complex clinical questionnaire? And what I define as a complex clinical questionnaire, the typical guidelines for a policy or requirements for prior authorization start with a list of criteria that a patient needs to meet. So an 18-year-old with a BMI greater than X, or does this patient have proven experience taking this medication with side effects? Those types of questions are what are currently in a lot of policies. The ultimate implementation of a questionnaire within the CMS-0057 would transform those questions. Instead of asking the provider, is the patient older than 18 and has a BMI greater than 59 or 52, the questionnaire would ask the provider, what is the patient's BMI? And that BMI would have a code associated to it, so that when it went over to the provider's electronic medical record system, that system would recognize the code for BMI and it would provide the information back to the payer in that form automatically without the provider having to manually answer those questions. The challenge in this industry with the timetable that we have to complete the 0057 requirements is that many payers have very complex policies. they might have hundreds or close to 1,000 policies that they enforce across various different procedures. Those policies have clinical guidelines or requirements that have been built out over many years and validated by clinicians at their health plan that essentially follow clinical best practice and validate that if somebody answers those questions appropriately, they do or do not meet clinical best practice. So converting those questionnaires from the current form, where they're more like guidelines, things that the provider needs to attest to have been met, the ultimate implementation of 0057 will involve totally transforming those guidelines into more clinical measures with associated codes. And that's a pretty big task for a health plan that's got 500 previously validated clinical questionnaires. So that's why people are wondering, what exactly do I have to do with those questionnaires? Do I have to fully transform them? Can I live with the way they are today in some fashion? Can I ask for the provider to attach documents like I do today? How can I make this transition from my web portal all the way over to 0057 in the timetable that's expected? And so with that, I'd like Keith to explain the answer, which, as you can see on the screen, is no. And he'll go deeply into the guidelines, but ultimately the questionnaire in this case is intended to be a method to communicate to the provider what is required to submit a prior authorization and allow them to communicate that information back to the payer. With that definition,
Sure.
a questionnaire can be as simple as a request for the provider to attach, 3 specific listed documents, right, Keith? Or would you like to expound on this? And then when
Sure.
you're ready, we'll
I think
get the
on the next
actual.
page, we have some policy language directly from the regulations that sort of explain the vision, and also we have direct responses to comments from CMS. So the vision for the prior authorization API is that it allows providers to query the payer's prior authorization documentation requirements directly from the provider system. So it's an API that replaces the workflows that today rely on websites, portals, faxes, and phone calls. And the language is that it could facilitate the automated compilation of necessary information to submit a prior authorization request. Really, CMS here is acknowledging that out of the gate, many certified EHR technologies won't have the ability to automatically compute answers to electronic questions. And also, there's a timeline for, on the payer side, digitizing your policy criteria and turning them into FHIR questionnaires. So we've developed tooling to help payers do that. And in the next bullet point, this is not legal advice. This is just an opinion. But what Michael was sharing is that we think if the response is sufficient for the provider to determine what information is required and is prior authorization even required at all, then ultimately we've satisfied this requirement and we're in line with the DaVinci implementation guides. In the response to comments, CMS-57 does not include a requirement for the prior authorization API to provide real-time processing. Rather, it's the goal that in the future, it should support it when those criteria are simple enough to answer. For example, if you have a policy that says this procedure is automatically authorized for a patient who has a BMI over 41 and this diagnosis code, those are 2 pieces of very simple information. And if those criteria are met, then we should instantly authorize that request. We should say, yes, this patient's approved, prior authorization is required, but you've provided that medical necessity information in your request. We're going to instantly give you your prior authorization number. So we think that's the vision. Where possible, you should do that. But where the provider needs to upload documentation, you need to have an API that allows them to upload that documentation without leaving their EHR. And that's what we support.
So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to questions and get your thoughts and questions on these topics. We can also look at the chat and answer some questions. Let's see. The first question is, how are policies being extracted from the policy documents? What's the back-end system, and how do we test for accuracy of the extraction process? So in the Utility Health policy system, when we ingest health plan policies, we work with the health plan to understand their current policy structure. Most health plans have a structure for their policies that has headers. So for instance, the first header might be policy description. The next header might be policy guidelines. There's typically a references section. There's usually a coding section. And so what we do is we work with the health plan to understand what are those sections in their policies. Typically that takes a couple of weeks to make sure we've looked through all of their policies to quickly verify that they all have those sections and that they are represented accurately with the data in the policies. If there are adjustments that need to be made, we work with the health plan to make adjustments to their policy language or sections to make sure we can ingest those sections appropriately. Sometimes there's two different versions of formats that they use, and in that case, we would have two different ingestion routines that would pull in the data from their current policies into the structured system that we have for the policy management tool. So once we've validated that we understand their structure, then it's simply an ingestion routine technology that goes into those policies that they have, either Word format or PDF format, and quickly deconstructs those policies into the appropriate sections and puts those into the Utility Health Policy Management tool. From there, we allow the client to look at the reconstituted version of a policy. So for instance, they can look at the full policy that comes from Utility Health's system, where we're actually taking those separate sections and putting them back together. And we allow them to quickly review those two versions, the reconstituted version from Utility Health and the original version. And they should look virtually identical. So there's a user acceptance process that goes into making sure that those ingested policies are accurate and correct. And then there's another step in the process where we are looking specifically at the codes. So all of the codes are ingested into a database, and all of the criteria that are ingested into the criteria section have another transformation that takes place between a listed set of criteria and the conversion to a JSON questionnaire. Love to talk more about that, but that's a pretty thorough conversation, and would be happy to set up a time one-to-one to dive into how a current criteria list on a health plan's policy becomes a FHIR questionnaire. Anything to add on that, Keith?
I have added a little bit more detail in the text response. I hope I captured the key parts of your answer, Michael. But I think the most important part is that when we are helping payer organizations implement their policies, often what we're doing is helping them standardize the language that they use and refine their criteria so that those criteria can be answered using coded data that is available within the EHR. So for, gosh, it's been almost 10 years, certified EHR technologies have been required to begin coding this information and making it available using the USCDI or the G10 APIs. These are standard FHIR resources that represent clinical data in the EHR. And so if we can make our policies reference that coded data wherever possible, it allows allows the answer to those criteria or individual questions within a policy to be more readily computed. Yeah.
The next question is regarding flagging urgent cases and helping prioritize prior auth requests for time-sensitive care. I know you answered it in writing, but perhaps you could verbalize your answer as well, Keith.
Sure. So in short, yes, the DaVinci IGs provide specific fields for a prior authorization status, the performing date or expected date of an upcoming procedure, so that on the utilization management side, when we pass that information along when manual review is necessary, they can appropriately sort and organize their work queue so that they know that they're hitting the things that are for today or tomorrow right away. Additionally, by allowing the automation of these simple cases, we reduce the burden where today a human might need to read through an entire form or an entire fax. We reduce that burden so that they can focus on the things that do actually require medical review. And we can automatically authorize the things that are plainly, clearly appropriate and appropriate use and can be immediately authorized.
So the next question is regarding clinical questionnaires. And essentially the way I read this is the author is saying that they're surprised that there's not going to be any set standardization between different payers regarding the types of questionnaires and the criteria that they use and those types of things. So to speak to that, it is the reality that each payer is allowed to create their own questionnaires and their own guidelines just as they are today. What CMS-0057 does do, though, is it creates a standardized structure and system for those questionnaires to be sent over to the payer. And ultimately, in the long view of this implementation, in a perfect world, all of the questions in the questionnaire would have a code associated to them that would be supported by the electronic health record, and therefore the EHR automatically answers the question. The reviewer at the provider organization simply has to look and see, oh yes, our EHR answered all the questions, hit the submit button, and everything is automated. That's the future view. And that would allow questionnaires to vary by payer and not put a huge burden on the provider. In the current world, of course, we all know that the variability of questions and criteria is a frustration for providers. I think in the short term, there are some really big wins that are going to come out of CMS-0057. First of all, the providers should not have to go to a different URL to see rules and information about each payer's rules, right? They can do it inside their EHR in a single application that shows all payers' data in a consistent format. So the provider organization has a lot of benefits, a quicker access to the data, consistent data, and an in-process system so they don't have to go to many different URLs to interact with the prior auth process, get status, etc. Obviously, in a perfect world, when we can get to a point where all of these questions are coded, that will make things easier. There are industry initiatives at pushing more and more standardized questionnaires among payers, but there's some pretty strong competitive pressures there, right? We have multiple organizations, the delegated vendors, the organizations that specifically supply medical policies and questionnaires. All of those organizations want to maintain their proprietary hold on this process and add value. So I think the ability to get to a single set of questionnaires that's common across all payers is something we're going to have to watch for. I think there's definitely some movement within various payers at trying to get closer to that. I'm not sure we're going to see that in the near term. The next question is about ROI or data showing the improved patient outcomes and access to care after implementation. CMS-0057 specifically has not been implemented anywhere at scale at this stage. So there are no proven outcomes from 0057. With that in mind, all of the systems we've talked about today from Itility Health are in place with existing payers at scale, but servicing the provider experience through provider portals, public web pages, or custom integrations to EMR systems. So the standard hasn't been implemented at scale anywhere today. However, even in early pilots, we're seeing great results in our systems that have been using these tools at scale. Even on a web page, we've seen dramatic savings for providers. Providers are no longer having to call the health plan to know, does it require prior authorization? They can get an accurate answer online from a website or a provider portal. Many cases, that accurate answer is different than what the answer might have been had you called the call center. There's been studies done that have shown that if you call the call center of the health plan, oftentimes about 30% of the time, you'll get the wrong answer. And if you can imagine, that wrong answer can maybe be that you don't need prior auth when you do, in which case you're going to get a denied claim, or as a hassle that you do need prior authorization when in fact you don't. So that accurate answer from the health plan through the current web portal experience and now through FHIR is an extreme benefit for the provider in that scenario. Another situation that we found is that providers are submitting a large number of prior auth requests for things that do not need prior authorization. So a big outcome for the provider and the payer is a reduced volume of prior auth requests. In many cases, that means that care can be delivered right away without waiting for a prior auth that wasn't required. So pretty significant impact on the process. We'd be happy to meet and talk specifically about numerical return on investment. We've seen explicitly from our health plan customers that they've saved millions of dollars in that scenario. Another question here is around turnaround time requirements to be met either by the health plan or by delegated vendors. We aren't prepared to talk specifically about that today, but yes, there are specific turnaround time requirements by the end of 2025, Jan 1, 2026, there are some specific turnaround time requirements that are applicable to the payer and the delegated vendor. Again, we'd be happy to talk about those in a separate session. We have another question. This one's really on topic for this session. How would your CRD response handle a case where the servicing provider is unknown at the time the ordering provider submits the request for the CRD? And I'll answer a bit of that, and then I'll ask Keith to jump in as well.
Sure.
My understanding would be that the most important thing about the servicing provider in prior auth, required or not, would be for gold carding. If a provider was gold carded, they would be able to gain an exception from prior auth requirements. Without that provider information, then the answer is going to assume that the provider is not gold carded. What would you add to that, Keith?
Just that in general, the answer to a CRD request is not just yes or no. The CRD response can say yes, no, it depends, and it's satisfied. So the it depends answer would be, for example, if we need the provider information to determine for this procedure, are they gold carded or not? And the it's satisfied is for when you say the performing provider is going to be, for example, one of those gold card providers. And we say, great, prior authorization, you don't need it, it's taken care of. Here's an authorization number that you can use in your claim to show that we provided that response to you. Typically, gold card providers, if they don't need any prior authorization at all, in that case, you say, no, But if it's a conditional or they want to automatically authorize it, automatic authorization can happen right at the very beginning of the workflow, right during CRD, before any forms are filled out.
And with that, we're at time. And so there's a number of questions that we didn't get to. We'll be happy to handle those in writing. And of course, offline, feel free to send an email to either myself or Keith, and we're happy to address your questions directly. And of course, would love to set up a time to spend a little more time with each of you to help your organization through this great opportunity that we all have to improve provider, payer, and most importantly, patient experience. So with that, I'll turn it back to Michael from WEDI, and thank you for your time today.
Michael with Itility. Thank you very much, you and Keith, and thank you to Itility Health. And thank you, I was about to bring that up. For part 2 of this event sponsored by Itility, it takes place September 4th, Connecting the Dots, Integrating Electric Prior Authorization with External Care Guideline Vendors, Case Management, and Claim Systems. You can register for that event at wedi.org. On behalf of WEDI and Itility, we thank you for attending and look forward to seeing you at a future WEDI event.